I stood in the middle of my grandfather's living room, surrounded by all the same furniture that had been there since I was a kid. The couch with the plaid pattern that always made me itch, the recliner where Grandpa Barry used to sit and read his newspaper every morning, the old TV cabinet with the family photos lined up on top. It was strange being there without him. "It's all yours now, Tucker," my grandmother said, pressing a set of keys into my palm. "The house. Everything in it." I closed my fingers around the keys. They were warm from being in Grandma Cindy's hand. "I still can't believe he's gone." "None of us can." She patted my arm. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She'd done her crying at the funeral 3 days ago. Now she was just tired. "Your grandfather wanted you to have it. He was very specific about that." I nodded, not really knowing what to say. The house was a 2-story Victorian on the edge of town. It had been in the family for generations. Worth a decent amount of money, I guessed. But that wasn't why it felt strange to suddenly own it. This place had always been Grandpa Barry's domain. "Do you need help packing anything?" I asked. Grandma shook her head. "I took what I wanted to bring to the condo, just some clothes and personal things. The rest," she waved her hand around the room, "it's part of the house now." "You sure you're okay with moving out?" I asked. "You don't have to go right away. I'm not planning to sell or anything." "I'm sure." Her voice was firm. "Too many memories here, and it's too big for just me. The condo's close to my sister, and it's all one level. No stairs to climb." I understood that. Grandpa had been gone only 3 days, but I could already feel his absence in every corner of the house. It must have been even harder for her. "You'll come for dinner tomorrow?" she asked. "I want to make sure the kitchen works in that new place." "Of course." She grabbed her purse from the coffee table. "I should get going. Marge is waiting to help me unpack." I walked her to the door and gave her a hug. She felt smaller than I remembered, frailer somehow, even though it had only been a week since I'd last seen her before the funeral. "Call if you need anything," I said. "I will." She stepped onto the porch, then turned back. "Tucker?" "Yeah?" "Your grandfather had his reasons for the things he did. Remember that." Before I could ask what she meant, she was heading down the steps toward her car. I watched until she drove away, then closed the door and leaned against it. Alone in my grandfather's house. My house now, I guess. I pushed away from the door and started walking through the rooms. The place was exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits. The dining room with its heavy oak table that could seat 12 people, though I'd never seen more than 5 around it. The kitchen with its outdated appliances but solid countertops. The study where Grandpa used to help me with homework. Memories came flooding back as I moved from room to room, playing board games on rainy days, helping Grandma bake cookies, listening to Grandpa's stories about his time in the Navy. This house had been my second home growing up, especially during those rough patches when my parents were fighting before their divorce. I ran my hand along the banister at the bottom of the stairs. The wood was smooth from decades of palms sliding over it. How many times had I raced up and down these steps as a kid? Too many to count. My mind drifted to the door on the second floor, the one at the end of the hallway that was always locked, the one Grandpa had made me promise never to open. I'd been 7 or 8 when I first asked about it. Grandpa's face had gone serious in a way I rarely saw. He'd put his hands on my shoulders and looked me right in the eyes. "That door stays locked for a reason, Tucker," he'd said. "Promise me you'll never try to open it. Not while I'm alive and not after I'm gone." I'd promised, of course. What else could I do with him staring at me like that? But it hadn't stopped me from being curious, from pressing my ear against the wood when no one was looking, from trying the handle every now and then, just to check if it was still locked. It always was. I climbed the stairs now, each step creaking in exactly the places I remembered. When I was 12, I'd memorized which boards made noise so I could sneak up at night without waking my grandparents. I'd been convinced there was something amazing behind that door, treasure maybe, or some kind of secret room like in the movies. The upstairs hallway was dim. 4 doors led off it. My grandparents' bedroom, the bathroom, the guest room where I used to sleep, and the locked door at the end. I hesitated, then turned toward my grandparents' room. The forbidden door could wait a little longer. Their bedroom was neat and orderly. The bed was made with hospital corners, the way Grandpa had learned in the Navy. The dresser tops were clear, except for a few framed photos. One showed my grandparents on their wedding day. Another was of my dad as a teenager. The third was me at my college graduation, standing between them with a goofy smile. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. What was I supposed to do with all their stuff? Keep it? Donate it? It felt wrong to just get rid of things that had been important to them. I pulled open the top drawer of Grandpa's nightstand. Inside were reading glasses, a flashlight, some loose change, and a dog-eared paperback Western novel. Normal stuff. The middle drawer held pens, notepads, and a small address book. Also normal. The bottom drawer stuck a little. I had to jiggle it to get it open. Inside was a stack of old letters tied with twine. They looked like they'd been read many times, the paper soft and creased at the edges. I lifted them out carefully and saw something underneath. A brass key. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my palm. I knew immediately what it opened. I'd seen Grandpa use a key just like this one to lock the door at the end of the hall. He'd always put it in his pocket afterward. I never knew where he kept it. I set the letters back in the drawer and closed it, but kept the key in my hand. I stood up and walked to the door, then out into the hallway. The forbidden door seemed to be waiting for me at the end of the corridor. Dark wood, slightly different from the other doors in the house. Older maybe, or just made by a different carpenter. I approached it slowly, remembering all the times I'd stood in this exact spot as a kid, wondering what was on the other side. All the theories I'd come up with, all the times I'd been tempted to break my promise. "Sorry, Grandpa," I murmured. "I know I promised, but you're gone now, and this is my house." The words sounded hollow, even to me, an excuse, but I'd been wondering about this door for over 20 years. I couldn't just leave it locked forever. I hesitated with the key an inch from the lock. What if there was a good reason Grandpa had wanted it to stay closed? What if he'd been protecting me from something? Grandma's parting words echoed in my head. Your grandfather had his reasons for the things he did, but curiosity won out. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism moved smoothly, as if it had been recently oiled. There was a soft click, and I felt the door unlock. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The hinges didn't creak like I'd expected. The door swung inward silently, revealing a small, square room with bare wooden floors and white walls. No furniture, no boxes of mysterious items, no treasure, just an empty room with a single window on the far wall. I stepped inside, oddly disappointed. After all those years of wondering, all I got was an empty room. Maybe Grandpa had cleaned it out before he died, removing whatever had been so important to keep locked away. I walked to the center of the room and turned in a circle, looking for any clue about why this space had been off limits. The walls were painted a flat white, no pictures or markings. The floor was hardwood like the rest of the house, maybe a little more worn. The ceiling was plain with a single light fixture in the center. And then there was the window. It was different from the others in the house, taller and narrower, with a deep sill. The glass looked old, slightly warped in places. Through it, I could see the backyard and the woods beyond. I moved closer to the window, drawn to it for some reason I couldn't explain. As I approached, I noticed faint markings etched into the glass. Symbols of some kind, arranged in a pattern around the edges. They weren't obvious. You'd have to be standing right in front of the window to see them. I reached out and touched the glass. It was cold under my fingertips, colder than it should have been on a warm spring day. And as my fingers traced one of the symbols, something strange happened. The view outside shifted, like a camera changing focus. The backyard and trees seemed to recede, and something else took their place. Another landscape entirely. Mountains I'd never seen before, under a sky that was the wrong color. And something was moving out there, coming toward the window. I stood frozen, my hand still pressed against the glass, as I realized my life was about to change forever. I jerked my hand away from the glass. The view outside snapped back to normal, just the overgrown backyard with its tall grass and the maple trees beyond the fence. My heart was pounding. I blinked hard and looked again, half expecting to see those strange mountains. But there was just the yard, exactly as it should be. I took a deep breath and looked more carefully at the window. The markings I'd noticed were barely visible, thin lines etched into the glass that formed symbols I didn't recognize. They looked old, like they'd been there for decades. I traced one with my fingertip again, more deliberately this time. The view shifted. But it wasn't mountains I saw now. It was our backyard. Except it wasn't overgrown anymore. The grass was neatly cut. The flower beds along the fence were full of color, and the old swing set that Grandpa had taken down years ago was standing right where it used to be. I gasped. This wasn't just any view of the yard. It was exactly how it looked about 20 years ago. I knew because there I was, little me, maybe 10 years old, running around with a baseball mitt on my hand. And there was Grandpa. He looked so much younger, his hair still more brown than gray, wearing those khaki shorts and the blue t-shirt he used to love. He was tossing a baseball to little me, deliberately throwing it a bit wide so I'd have to reach for it. I watched as little me missed the catch, the ball bouncing off the edge of my mitt. Grandpa shouted something encouraging, but I couldn't hear the words. It was like watching a silent movie. Little me was laughing, not at all upset about missing the catch. Grandpa jogged over to retrieve the ball, then pretended to miss an easy catch himself, making an exaggerated fumbling motion that had little me doubled over with laughter. "This isn't possible," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass slightly. But there it was, playing out right in front of me. A memory, a perfect, intact memory from 20 years ago. I remembered that day. It was spring, just after my birthday. Grandpa had given me my first real baseball mitt, and we spent the whole weekend breaking it in. I stood there watching for, I don't know how long, little me getting better with each catch. Grandpa's patient coaching, the way he'd ruffle my hair when I made a good play. Eventually, I noticed the window latch. It was old-fashioned, the kind you turn to lock or unlock. I reached for it, wondering what would happen if I opened the window. Would the scene disappear? Would I hear them? I turned the latch and pushed the window up. The backyard scene vanished instantly. 1 second I was looking at my younger self playing catch with Grandpa, and the next, nothing, just empty air. And then I realized I wasn't looking through the window anymore. I was standing outside on the lawn, looking up at the house. What the hell? I spun around, disoriented. The grass was tall and unkempt under my feet. The current, neglected yard. I was outside, but I had no memory of walking downstairs or out the back door. I looked up at the second floor of the house. There was the window I'd been looking through, now open, the white curtain stirring slightly in the breeze. I walked back to the house, my mind racing. Had I blacked out? Sleepwalked? None of it made any sense. I went in through the kitchen door, which I didn't remember unlocking, and made my way back upstairs. The door to the small room was still standing open. I paused in the doorway, half expecting something to have changed, but it looked exactly the same. Empty, bare floors, white walls, and the window, still open as I'd left it. I approached it cautiously. The strange symbols were still there, etched into the glass. I touched one of them again, and the view changed. This time I saw a much younger version of my grandfather, probably in his 20s. He was kneeling by the fence, digging holes and planting what looked like small bushes. Rose bushes, I realized. The same ones that still grew along the back fence, now wild and overgrown without his care. I watched him work, methodical and careful. He'd dig a hole, add something from a bag beside him. Fertilizer, probably. Then gently place the plant and fill in the soil around it. He was wearing old jeans and a white t-shirt that was getting progressively dirtier as he worked. This must have been shortly after they bought the house. Grandpa would have been what, 25? 26? He looked so young, but I could still see the grandpa I knew in his face. In the careful way he handled the plants, in the slight furrow of concentration between his eyebrows. I pulled my hand away, and the image faded back to the current yard. I touched another symbol, and the view shifted again. This time, I saw Grandma, young and pretty with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was hanging laundry on a clothesline that used to run from the house to an old post near the back fence. Sheets and towels flapped in the breeze. Grandpa came into view, carrying a basket of wet clothes. He set it down and started helping her, the two of them working together, talking and laughing. I wondered if I could control what I was seeing. I focused my thoughts on a specific time, my 8th birthday party in the backyard, and touched another symbol. The view shifted, and there it was. Balloons tied to the fence, a folding table with a cake, and me, surrounded by a small group of friends, blowing out candles while my parents and grandparents watched. I remembered that day perfectly. The chocolate cake, with buttercream frosting. Tommy Miller pushing me into the grass after I opened his present. Dad taking pictures with his old film camera. I tried again. My father as a kid. I touched a different symbol and concentrated. There he was. Stevie Davenport at maybe 6 or 7, wobbling on a bicycle while Grandpa jogged alongside, one hand on the back of the seat. I watched as Grandpa let go and Dad kept pedaling, not realizing at first that he was riding on his own. When he did notice, his face lit up with such pride that I felt my throat tighten. I spent the next few hours at that window, touching different symbols, focusing on different times. I saw Grandpa's first date with Grandma at a local diner, both of them so young and nervous, their wedding in the backyard, Grandma in a simple white dress with flowers in her hair. Christmas mornings, summer barbecues, ordinary days that had happened decades before I was born. It was like a family history playing out before my eyes. Always centered on the house or yard, always silent, but otherwise perfect in every detail. As afternoon turned to evening and the natural light began to fade, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In each scene, no matter what period or event I was watching, there were shadows that didn't quite behave as they should. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But as I paid closer attention, I could see it clearly. Shadows at the edges of each scene that moved independently of the people or objects casting them. They seemed to stretch, to reach toward the window when they shouldn't have been able to move that way. In a scene of Grandpa mowing the lawn one summer day, the shadow of the maple tree extended toward the house, though the sun's position should have cast it in the opposite direction. While watching a teenage version of my dad washing his first car in the driveway, I noticed the shadow of the car elongating, stretching like taffy toward the window where I stood watching. The more I noticed it, the more disturbing it became. In every scene, if I watched long enough, the shadows would begin to behave wrongly, and they always moved toward the window. Toward me. As full darkness fell outside, the shadows in each scene I called up seemed to grow darker, more substantial. In a Christmas memory of our family gathered around a bonfire in the backyard, the shadow of the flames didn't flicker upward but crawled along the ground toward the house, like a living thing seeking entrance. I pulled my hand away from the glass, suddenly cold despite the warm evening. The shadows, they weren't just moving wrong. They were reaching for the window, for the symbols, for a way in. I couldn't stop thinking about the window. After seeing those shadows reaching toward me, I should have been terrified, and I was, but curiosity kept pulling me back. The next morning, I made coffee and tried to focus on normal things. Called my dad to check in. Wandered around the house making lists of what needed fixing. But my thoughts kept drifting upstairs to that small room. By afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the door again. Just one more look, I told myself, just to make sure I hadn't imagined it all. The symbols were still there, faint lines etched into the glass. I touched one hesitantly, and the view shifted immediately. This time I saw the backyard in winter, covered in snow. My grandparents were younger, maybe in their 50s, building a snowman with me. I was probably 8 or 9. I pulled my hand away, and the scene vanished. The normal backyard returned, overgrown and quiet in the afternoon sun. "This is crazy," I muttered, but I couldn't walk away. I touched another symbol, and another memory appeared. A family barbecue. My dad flipping burgers while Mom arranged plates. I spent hours that first day just watching fragments of the past. When evening came, I reluctantly left the room, locked the door, and tried to eat dinner. But my mind was upstairs. The next morning, I woke up early and headed straight for the room. This time I tried to be more methodical. I touched each symbol in sequence, watching different scenes from our family history. Some I recognized, others happened before I was born. I saw my dad as a teenager, helping Grandpa fix the roof. I watched my grandparents dance in the living room when they thought no one was watching. Around midday, I touched a symbol near the bottom of the glass and saw something different. Not a family memory, but Grandpa alone, carrying lumber and tools into the backyard. He looked younger than I'd ever known him, maybe in his 30s. I watched as he measured and cut, building what looked like the frame for a small structure. I leaned closer. Was he building this room? The very room I was standing in? Over the next few hours, I followed his progress. The window seemed to understand what I wanted to see. Each time I touched the glass, it showed me the next stage of construction. Grandpa worked alone, methodically building the small addition onto the back of the second floor. When he installed the window, I paid close attention. He handled it carefully, almost reverently. This wasn't just any window. He positioned it precisely, measuring multiple times before securing it in place. Then he took out a small tool, something that looked like an engraving pen, and began etching the symbols into the glass. His movements were precise, his concentration absolute. This wasn't random. He knew exactly what he was doing. I came back the next day, drawn to the window like it was calling to me. This time I searched for earlier memories. I wanted to see where the window came from. It took me a while to find the right symbol, but eventually I saw Grandpa in what looked like an antique shop, examining the window. The shop owner, an elderly man with thick glasses, was speaking to him seriously. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the intensity on both their faces. Money changed hands, a lot of it. Grandpa carefully wrapped the window in blankets before loading it into his truck. So he hadn't made it. He'd found it somewhere. On the third day, I started noticing something troubling. The shadows I'd seen before were becoming more prominent in every scene. They seemed to linger at the edges, stretching toward the window in ways that defied physics. In one memory of a family picnic, the shadow of a tree bent at an impossible angle, reaching toward where I stood watching. I stepped back from the window, rubbing my eyes. When I looked again, the shadows seemed normal. But as soon as I relaxed, they started moving again. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I checked, no one was there. The house felt different somehow, like it wasn't quite empty anymore. On the fourth day, I returned to the room early. The morning sun streamed through the window, making the symbols almost invisible. I had to stand at an angle to see them at all. I touched one and saw Grandpa in his study, reading a thick, leather-bound book. He looked about the age I remembered from my childhood visits. He was alone, completely absorbed in whatever he was reading. As I watched him, a crazy thought struck me. The window showed the past, but what if it was more than just a viewing portal? What if it could do more? "Grandpa," I said out loud, feeling ridiculous. "Can you hear me?" His head snapped up instantly. His eyes widened as he looked directly at the window, directly at me. The book fell from his hands. I'd never seen that expression on his face before. Pure terror. He backed away from his desk, never taking his eyes off the window. His lips were moving, and I strained to hear him. His voice came through faintly, like a bad phone connection. "Close it," he was saying. "Tucker, close it now, don't." The rest was too faint to hear, but he knew it was me. Somehow, he knew I was watching from the future. This wasn't just a window to the past, it was a connection. I had so many questions. Why had he locked this room? What was he afraid of? Maybe if I opened the window, I could hear him better. Maybe I could even talk to him. I reached for the latch, hesitated for just a second, then flipped it open and pushed the window up. The room exploded with darkness. There's no other way to describe it. A massive shadow erupted from the window, pouring into the room like liquid smoke. It writhed and twisted, never settling into one shape, but constantly shifting between forms that hurt my eyes to look at. Within the churning darkness, 2 points of burning red appeared, eyes watching me with a terrible intelligence. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The shadow entity filled the small room, growing larger by the second, stretching toward me with appendages that weren't quite arms. I'd made a terrible mistake. I scrambled backward, my hands and feet slipping on the wooden floor. The shadow thing filled the entire room now, stretching from wall to wall, ceiling to floor. It moved toward me with a purpose that made my stomach drop. The cold coming off it burned my skin like dry ice. "Jesus!" I gasped, pushing myself further away. The shadow twisted and writhed, those red points, eyes, fixed on me. A tendril of darkness shot out, slamming into the floor where I'd been sitting just seconds before. The wood splintered with a crack that echoed through the room. I rolled to the side as another tendril whipped past my head. My heart hammered so hard I could barely breathe. I scrambled onto my hands and knees and started crawling toward the door. The shadow made a sound like fabric tearing, like something ripping apart at the seams. "Shit, shit, shit," I muttered, my palms slapping against the floor as I moved. Another tendril slammed down beside me, close enough that I felt the air displacement. I lunged forward, throwing myself through the doorway. I spun around, grabbed the door, and slammed it shut with both hands. My fingers fumbled, with the key still hanging in the lock. I turned it with shaking hands, the metal slipping in my sweaty grip. The lock clicked just as something massive struck the door from the inside. The entire frame rattled, and I jumped back. The door shook again with another impact, then another. The wood groaned under the pressure. I backed away, watching as the door bulged slightly with each new strike. Whatever was in there wanted out, and it was strong enough to break through if I didn't do something. I turned and raced down the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I nearly fell at the bottom, catching myself on the banister. The pounding from upstairs continued, each impact sending vibrations through the house. The garage. Dad had kept tools there, Grandpa too. I ran through the kitchen and yanked open the door to the attached garage. The overhead light flickered on when I hit the switch. I scanned the pegboard on the far wall, looking for anything useful. Hammer. Nails. There. I grabbed a claw hammer from a hook and snatched a box of 3-inch nails from the workbench. The pounding upstairs had gotten louder, more insistent. I stuffed my pockets with nails and ran back inside. Taking the stairs 3 at a time, I reached the second-floor landing and froze. The door at the end of the hall was bulging outward with each strike from within. The wood splintered around the hinges, small cracks appearing with each impact. I approached slowly, hammer gripped tight in my right hand, nails clutched in my left. The door shuddered with another blow. A crack ran from the top hinge to the middle of the door. "Okay," I whispered to myself. "Okay." I set the box of nails on the floor and took out a handful. Placing one against the door frame, I hammered it in with 3 quick strikes. The shadow thing inside slammed against the door again, and I stumbled back. But the nail held. I moved to the other side of the frame and drove in another nail, then another. I worked my way around the entire door, hammering nails into the frame every few inches. My hands were shaking so badly I missed a few times, leaving small dents in the wood and nearly hitting my fingers. The pounding never stopped. Each impact made me flinch, but I kept working, driving nails into the top of the frame, then down the sides. I used up the first handful and went back for more, hammering until sweat ran down my face and my arm ached. When I finished, nails surrounded the entire door frame, 20, maybe 30 of them driven deep into the wood. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. It had to hold. I backed away, watching as the door continued to shake. The nails creaked, but stayed put. The wood splintered a bit more with each blow, but the door remained shut. I retreated to my old bedroom across the hall and found my old Louisville Slugger in the closet. I gripped the baseball bat with both hands and went back to sit on the floor in the hallway, facing the door. The pounding continued. For minutes. Then hours. I sat there watching, the bat across my knees, afraid to move. My phone said it was just past midnight, then 1, then 2. The attacks didn't slow or weaken. If anything, they grew more frenzied as the night wore on. Each impact made the door bulge, the nails straining against the force. Small splinters of wood fell to the floor with each blow. I tried to make sense of what was happening. The window, the memories, the shadows. None of it should have been possible, but here I was, sitting in a hallway in the middle of the night, watching a door being attacked from the inside by something that shouldn't exist. Grandpa knew. He'd known all along. That's why he'd made me promise never to go in there. That's why he'd kept it locked. I remembered his face in that last memory, the terror in his eyes when he'd seen me watching. Close the window, he'd said. He'd known what would happen. The attacks continued through the night. 3 a.m., 4. My back ached from sitting on the hard floor, but I didn't dare move. I just watched the door shake, the wood splintering a little more each time. Near dawn, the pounding finally began to slow. The impacts came less frequently, with less force behind them. By 5:30, they had stopped completely. I sat there, not trusting the silence. Minutes ticked by. 10, 20, 30. Nothing. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the window at the end of the hall. Birds began chirping outside, normal morning sounds that felt completely out of place after the night I'd just had. I waited another hour, muscles stiff, before finally setting the bat aside and standing up. My legs protested after sitting for so long, and I stretched, keeping my eyes on the door. Nothing moved. No sound came from behind it. I took a tentative step forward, then another. The floorboard creaked under my weight, and I froze. Still nothing from behind the door. I got close enough to touch it, but I couldn't bring myself to put my ear against the wood. The silence was almost worse than the pounding had been. At least when it was attacking, I knew where it was. I backed away and picked up the bat again. I wasn't going to check what was in there. Not alone. Not after what I'd seen. I needed help. But who would believe me? What would I even say? I took out my phone and opened my contacts, scrolling until I found the local police non-emergency number. I hit dial before I could talk myself out of it. County Sheriff's Department, a woman's voice answered. "I need help," I said, my voice hoarse from the long night. "Something's happened at my house. I don't know how to explain it." I heard the police car pull into the driveway about 10 minutes after my call. The red and blue lights flashed through the front windows, making weird patterns on the wall. I went to the door and opened it before they even knocked. 2 officers stood on the porch, a tall guy with a buzz cut and a shorter woman with her black hair pulled back tight. "Mr. Davenport?" the woman asked. "Yeah, that's me. Tucker Davenport. Thanks for coming so fast." "I'm Officer Pierce," she said. "And this is Officer Mitchell. You reported an intruder?" "Yeah, well, sort of." I stepped back to let them in. "It's complicated, but there's something trapped upstairs." Officer Mitchell's hand moved to rest on his holster. "Something. Someone," I corrected myself. "Sorry, I'm pretty freaked out right now." They exchanged a quick glance. Officer Pierce pulled out a small notepad. "You said on the phone that something happened at your house. Can you explain what you meant?" "It's better if I show you. It's upstairs." I pointed toward the staircase. I managed to trap it in a room. "It?" Officer Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Them. The person." I was making a mess of this. "Sorry, I haven't slept." Officer Mitchell nodded to his partner. "I'll take the lead. You stay behind me, sir." I followed them up the stairs, trying to figure out what I was going to say when they saw the room. The truth wasn't an option. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. When we reached the landing, I pointed down the hall. "It's that door at the end, the one with all the nails." Officer Mitchell moved cautiously forward, one hand still on his weapon. When he reached the door, he examined the nails I'd hammered into the frame. "You did this?" he asked, turning back to look at me. "Yeah, it was trying to get out. I didn't know what else to do." Officer Pierce stepped past me, speaking quietly into her radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Pierce. We're at 1478 Cedar Lane, requesting backup for a possible barricaded suspect." A crackling voice responded that units were on the way. "Has there been any noise from inside recently?" Officer Mitchell asked, pressing his ear carefully to the door but not touching it. "No. It stopped about an hour ago." "And you're certain someone is in there?" "Yes, definitely." I wasn't lying about that part, at least. "Do you know who it is? Did you see their face?" I shook my head. "No. It was dark. I woke up and heard someone in there. When I checked, they slammed the door. I grabbed some nails from the garage and trapped them inside." Officer Pierce wrote something in her notebook. "How did they get in your house?" "I don't know. Maybe I left a door unlocked." "And they went straight to this room? Nothing was taken from downstairs?" I hadn't thought that part through. "I guess so. Maybe they were looking for something specific." Officer Mitchell ran his fingers along the doorframe, examining the nails. "These are in pretty deep." He turned to his partner. "I'll need a pry bar from the car." "I'll get it," she said, heading back down the stairs. While she was gone, Officer Mitchell kept asking questions. How long had I lived here? Was I alone in the house? Did I have any enemies? Had there been any other break-ins recently? I answered everything as vaguely as I could without seeming suspicious. Officer Pierce returned with a crowbar, and 2 more police cars pulled up outside. I heard doors slamming and voices downstairs. "Backup's here," she said. 2 more officers came up the stairs, both with their hands on their weapons. "What's the situation?" one of them asked. "Possible intruder barricaded in this room," Officer Mitchell said. "We're going to open the door." He positioned himself to the side of the door and started prying out the nails one by one. They made a screeching sound as they came loose, and I flinched each time. Part of me wanted to tell them to stop, to just leave the door nailed shut, forever. But it was too late for that. The 4 officers arranged themselves in the hallway, 2 on each side of the door. Officer Mitchell had his hand on the doorknob while the others had their weapons drawn. "Stay back, sir," Officer Pierce told me, and I moved a few steps down the hallway. Officer Mitchell looked at the others. "Ready? On 3. 1, 2, 3. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. The officers moved in quickly, sweeping the room with their weapons. "Clear!" one of them called out after a few seconds. "Clear!" echoed another. I stepped forward to look past them, and my stomach dropped. The room was destroyed. The walls were covered in deep gouges, like something with massive claws had torn into them. Chunks of drywall littered the floor. The wooden floorboards were ripped up in places, exposing the joists beneath. And the window was completely shattered, with shards of glass scattered across the room. Cold air blew in through the empty frame. But there was no shadow entity. No intruder. Nothing. "What the hell happened in here?" Officer Mitchell muttered, looking around at the destruction. I stood frozen in the doorway. "I don't know. It was like this when I heard the noise. That's why I checked." Officer Pierce turned to me with a skeptical expression. "You said you trapped someone in here." "I thought I did. I heard something moving around." One of the other officers was examining the claw marks on the wall. "These are deep. What could have done this?" "An animal, maybe?" another suggested. In a second-floor room? Officer Pierce shook her head. I stepped into the room, careful to avoid the broken glass. The symbols that had been etched into the window were gone along with the glass. All that remained was the empty frame, with a few jagged shards still clinging to the edges. Maybe they escaped through the window? I suggested. Officer Mitchell leaned out the window frame and looked down. It's a straight drop to the ground. No trees nearby, no trellis, nothing to climb down on. We should check the yard, one of the officers said, and two of them headed downstairs. Officer Pierce was watching me closely. Mr. Davenport, this doesn't add up. You said you heard someone in here and trapped them by nailing the door shut. But there's no one here, and no obvious way they could have escaped. I know how it looks, I said, but I swear I heard something in here. We need to document this, Officer Mitchell said, pulling out his phone to take pictures of the damage. I stood in the middle of the room, trying to make sense of it myself. The shadow entity had been real. I hadn't imagined it. But how could I explain what had happened without sounding completely insane? About 20 minutes later, another car pulled up outside. Through the broken window, I saw a dark sedan with a police light on the dashboard. Detectives here, Officer Pierce said, looking out the window. A few minutes later, a woman in her 40s with auburn hair pulled back in a tight bun appeared in the doorway. She wore a gray pantsuit and carried a small leather notebook. Detective Spencer, she introduced herself, showing me her badge. I understand we have an unusual situation here. Officer Mitchell briefed her on what they'd found, or rather, what they hadn't found. Detective Spencer nodded, taking it all in, then turned to me. Mr. Davenport, I'd like to speak with you downstairs if you don't mind. I followed her to the kitchen, where we sat across from each other at the table. She placed a small recorder between us. Do you mind if I record our conversation? She asked. Go ahead. She pressed a button on the recorder. Detective Joan Spencer interviewing Tucker Davenport regarding incident at 1478 Cedar Lane. Mr. Davenport, please tell me exactly what happened tonight. I told her the same story I'd given the officers, that I'd heard noises, investigated, and trapped an intruder in the room. I left out everything about the window showing the past, the shadows, and the entity that had emerged. And you didn't see this intruder at all? She asked. No, it was dark. But you're certain someone was in there? Yes. She tapped her pen against her notebook. The damage in that room is extensive. It would have taken considerable time and effort. Did you hear all of that happening? Some of it. That's why I called. And yet you didn't mention any of this destruction when you called, or when the officers arrived. You just said there was an intruder. I shifted in my chair. I was scared. I wasn't thinking clearly. Detective Spencer continued asking questions for what felt like hours. She circled back to the same points repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies in my story. I stuck to my intruder explanation, even though I could tell she wasn't buying it. Mr. Davenport, I'm going to be straight with you, she said eventually. Your story doesn't make sense. The room shows signs of significant destruction, but there's no evidence anyone was in there except you. The window is broken from the inside out, not the other way around, and there's no feasible way anyone could have escaped from that room once you nailed the door shut. I know how it sounds, I said for what felt like the 10th time. Yes, it sounds like you're not telling me the truth. She leaned forward. Did you cause that damage yourself? No. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is someone threatening you? No, nothing like that. She sat back and studied me. This house belonged to your grandfather, correct? Barry Davenport? Yes, he left it to me when he died. And how long have you been living here? Just a few days. She made another note. Was there anything unusual about the house when you moved in? Anything your grandfather warned you about? I hesitated, remembering Grandpa's warning about the locked door. No, nothing specific. Detective Spencer didn't believe me, that was obvious. But without evidence of a break-in or any crime beyond property damage to my own house, there wasn't much she could do. After about 3 hours of questioning, she finally closed her notebook. "We'll file a report on this incident. If you remember any additional details, please contact me directly." She handed me her card. The officers took more photos, collected a few shards of glass as evidence, and finally left around dawn. I stood in the doorway watching their cars pull away, exhaustion hitting me like a physical weight. When they were gone, I went back upstairs to the ruined room. In the morning light, the destruction looked even worse. The claw marks in the walls were deep and deliberate, forming patterns that almost looked like writing in some places. The floorboards were splintered and torn, and glass crunched under my feet. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the empty window frame. Now I understood why Grandpa had kept this door locked all those years. The window hadn't just shown the past, it had been a barrier. And by opening it, I'd broken the seal my grandfather had maintained, letting through something that had been watching through all those glimpses of history. I made 3 phone calls the next morning, first to the contractor for the window, then the carpenter for the door, then my boss to use some vacation days. Figured I'd need to be around to supervise the work. Wasn't about to leave this to chance. Derek Woods showed up at 9 sharp, his truck rumbling into the driveway right on time. He had that weathered look of someone who'd been in construction his whole life. Work cap pulled low, flannel with the sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill. "Mr. Davenport," he said, extending a hand as he climbed out of his truck. "Tucker," I said, shaking it. His grip was firm, calloused. "Thanks for coming on short notice." He nodded, already looking past me at the house. "So we're bricking up a window. 2nd floor?" "Yeah, I'll show you." I led him through the house and up the stairs. The nailed-up door was still intact, though I'd removed most of the nails after the police left. Derek didn't say anything about it, just followed me, silently. When we reached the room, I pushed the door open. The morning light streamed in through the empty window frame, highlighting all the destruction. The claw marks on the walls looked even worse in daylight. Derek let out a low whistle. What happened in here? I'd prepared for this question. Animal damage. Something got in through the window. He walked over to the window frame, examining the jagged edges where glass had been. Must have been one hell of an animal. Yeah, that's why I want it sealed up completely. Brick, mortar, the works. He ran his hand along the wall beside the window, fingers tracing one of the deep gouges. These don't look like any animal marks I've seen. Bear, maybe? Though that'd be unusual around here. I don't know what it was, I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. I just want to make sure it doesn't come back. Derek nodded, pulling a tape measure from his belt and checking the dimensions of the window. Standard size, won't be complicated. He jotted some numbers on a small notepad. You wanting to match the exterior brick? Doesn't matter, this will be a storage room, just needs to be solid. Solid I can do. He tapped the wall. I'll need to run to the supply store for materials. Be back in about an hour. While Derek was gone, I cleaned up some of the glass and debris from the floor. I couldn't do much about the gouges in the walls or the splintered floorboards, but I wanted to clear out anything that might get in his way. Every few minutes, I'd look at the empty window frame and feel a chill. The morning was bright and clear outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Derek returned with his truck loaded with bricks, bags of mortar, and tools. He worked methodically, mixing the mortar in a bucket on the floor that he'd covered with a tarp. I stayed in the room, watching. You don't have to stick around, he said, laying the first row of bricks. This'll take a few hours. I don't mind, I said, leaning against the far wall. I want to make sure it's done right. He shrugged. Suit yourself. I watched as he carefully placed each brick, smoothing mortar between them with practiced movements. The window slowly disappeared, brick by brick. I felt my shoulders gradually relax as the opening closed. "So," Derek said after about an hour of working in silence, "you just move in? House seems pretty empty." "It was my grandfather's. He passed recently." "Sorry to hear that." I nodded my thanks. "He left it to me. I'm still figuring out what to do with it." Derek worked for another few minutes before speaking again. "These scratches, they're pretty deep. Whatever did this had some serious claws. You sure it was an animal?" "What else would it be?" I countered. He shrugged, not looking up from his work. "Just saying. Seen a lot of weird stuff in this line of work. Houses settling, pipes expanding, all kinds of things that make strange noises. But these marks..." He shook his head. "These were made by something that knew what it was doing." I didn't respond to that, just watched as he laid another row of bricks. "Your grandfather ever mention any problems with this room?" Derek asked. "He kept it locked," I admitted. "Never let anyone in here." Derek nodded as if that explained something. "Smart man, maybe." By early afternoon, the window was completely bricked up. Derek smoothed the last of the mortar and stepped back to examine his work. "That'll hold," he said. "Give it about 24 hours to set properly." I stared at the new brick wall. It looked solid, permanent. No trace remained of the window that had shown me impossible things. "Good," I said, feeling genuine relief. "Very good." Derek packed up his tools while I wrote him a check. He seemed to be studying me as I handed it over. "Whatever was in here," he said, gesturing to the room, "I hope it stays out." "That's the plan." After Derek left, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, waiting for my next appointment. The carpenter, Ricky Grant, was scheduled for 3 o'clock to install the new door. I'd been specific about what I wanted: solid steel, multiple deadbolts, the kind of door that wouldn't budge no matter what was behind it. Ricky arrived 15 minutes early, his van pulling up beside the curb. He was younger than Derek, maybe late 30s, with a neatly trimmed goatee and a leather tool belt slung over his shoulder. "Tucker Davenport?" he asked, smiling broadly as I opened the door. "Ricky Grant. Got your door in the van. Heavy son of a gun, I'll tell you that. Need help bringing it in?" "Nah, I got a dolly, but I'll take a look at where it's going first if that's all right." I led him upstairs to the room. The brick wall where the window had been looked solid and permanent now, though the mortar was still drying. The rest of the room was still a disaster: gouged walls, splintered floorboards. Ricky let out a low whistle. "Whoa, what happened in here?" "Water damage," I lied. "Had to tear out a lot of drywall." He looked skeptical, but didn't press the issue. "And you want a steel security door for this room? The one on the phone with 3 deadbolts?" "That's right." "Mind if I ask what you're storing in here? Gold bars?" He laughed at his own joke. "Just some family heirlooms," I said. "My grandfather was particular about security." Ricky nodded, measuring the door frame. "This'll need some adjusting to fit the new door. I'll get started." He worked efficiently, first removing the old door and frame completely, then building a new frame to accommodate the steel door. I watched from the hallway as he worked, occasionally answering questions, but mostly staying quiet. "So this is going to be locked from the outside, right?" Ricky asked as he fitted the frame. "Not the kind of setup you'd want if someone's going to be in this room." "It's just for storage," I repeated. Right. He continued working, humming to himself. 3 deadbolts, though. That's serious security. Most people go with 1 good lock, maybe 2 if they're cautious. I like to be thorough." Ricky glanced at me, then at the gouged walls. "I can see that." It took him about 4 hours to install the door properly. The steel was thick and heavy, painted a flat black that absorbed light. When he closed it, it made a solid thunk that was oddly reassuring. "Okay," Ricky said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Want to check it out? All 3 deadbolts work smooth." I stepped forward and tried each lock. They turned with precision, the bolts sliding firmly into the frame with satisfying clicks. Perfect, I said. You got the only keys, he said, handing me a small envelope with 3 identical keys inside. No copies on my end. I paid him, adding a generous tip that made his eyebrows raise. Thanks, he said. Whatever you're keeping in there must be important. It is, I said. Very important that it stays locked up. After Ricky left, I stood in front of the new door for a long time. It looked imposing, solid black steel with 3 separate keyholes arranged vertically down the side. I locked all 3 deadbolts, testing each one twice to make sure they were secure. But it didn't feel like enough. I went down to the garage and found some leftover lumber from one of my grandfather's old projects. I brought up several 2x4s and a box of nails. Working methodically, I nailed boards across the doorframe, securing them to the wall on either side. It was overkill, I knew that. With the door bricked up and a steel door with 3 deadbolts, nothing was getting in or out, but I needed the extra reassurance. When I finished, I stepped back to examine my work. The boards formed a crude X across the door. It looked like something from a horror movie, but I didn't care. I just needed to know it was secure. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house settling made me tense up. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up and went downstairs to the study. I hadn't spent much time in there yet. It had been my grandfather's private space, and it still felt like I was intruding. The study was lined with bookshelves, most filled with practical books on carpentry, gardening, and home repair. One shelf held photo albums. Another had my grandfather's collection of Louis L'Amour westerns. I sat in his old leather chair and ran my hands along the armrests, worn smooth from years of use. The desk drawer stuck slightly when I pulled it open. Inside were the usual things: pens, paper clips, a stapler. But at the back was a small leather-bound book I hadn't noticed before. I pulled it out and opened it. The first page had my grandfather's name, Barry Davenport, written in his precise handwriting, followed by a date, June 12th, 1962. It was a journal. I flipped through the pages, scanning entries. Most were mundane: notes about garden plantings, household repairs, comments about the weather. But then I found an entry from July 1962 that made me sit up straight. "Found something strange in the upstairs room today," he had written. "The window shows things, not just the yard as it is, but as it was. Watched my father plant the oak tree when I was just a boy. 30 years ago at least. The symbols on the glass seem to control it somehow. I don't understand how this is possible, but I've tested it repeatedly. It's real." I kept reading, turning pages quickly now. My grandfather had discovered the room's properties just as I had. He'd watched his own past, his parents, his childhood. But then the entries took a darker turn. "Something watches back," he wrote in August. "I can feel it when I use the window. Something waiting on the other side. The shadows move wrong. I've started locking the door when I'm not in there." The entries about the room became less frequent after that, as if he was using it less. Then, near the end of the journal, I found an entry dated just 2 months before his death. "Sealed the room today, permanently. The window is too dangerous. The thing on the other side is getting stronger. I can feel it pushing against the glass. It wants in. I should have destroyed the window years ago, but I couldn't give up seeing the past. My weakness. If you're reading this, never open that window. Never." I closed the journal, my hands shaking slightly. My grandfather had known. He'd experienced exactly what I had decades earlier, and he'd had the wisdom to lock the door and keep it locked. I took the journal to the living room fireplace. It was a cool night, but I built a fire anyway, arranging kindling and logs the way my grandfather had taught me. When the flames were strong, I hesitated for a moment, then placed the journal on top of the burning logs. The leather cover curled and blackened, the pages caught quickly, edges turning orange then black, words disappearing into ash. I watched until there was nothing left but embers. I understood now, the temptation and the wisdom. The window offered something incredible, a chance to visit the past, to see loved ones again. But the price was too steep. Whatever waited on the other side wasn't just watching, it was hunting, looking for a way in. The next day, I called a real estate agent to list my condo in the city. I'd keep the house, but I wouldn't live in it. Couldn't live in it. Not with what I knew was upstairs, locked behind steel and brick. I found Clifford Graham through a service that specialized in property caretakers. He was older, around 60, with weathered skin and few words. Perfect. The house needs regular maintenance, I explained when he came to look the place over. Lawn care, cleaning, general upkeep. I'll be checking in periodically, but you'll be the primary caretaker. Clifford nodded, making notes in a small pad. Reasonable enough. There's one more thing. I led him upstairs and showed him the sealed door with its boards and multiple locks. This room stays closed, always. Under no circumstances is this door to be opened or tampered with. Clifford stared at the door, then at me. Storage? Yes, I said. Very valuable, very dangerous family heirlooms. The door stays shut. He nodded once, seemingly untroubled by the strange request. Not my business what's behind doors, long as I know which ones to leave alone. Just this one, I said. The rest of the house is yours to maintain. We shook hands on it, and I felt a weight lift. The house would be cared for, the door would remain sealed, and I could keep my distance, close enough to check that everything remained secure, far enough to sleep at night. Before I left, I stood in the upstairs hallway one last time, looking at the sealed door. Whatever was behind it would stay there. My grandfather had been right all along. Some doors should remain locked. Some windows should never be opened. I checked my watch as I pulled into the driveway. 10 in the morning, right on schedule for my weekly visit. The house looked normal from the outside, just another suburban property with slightly overgrown grass and shutters that needed a fresh coat of paint. Nobody driving past would guess what was inside. I grabbed my notebook from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The air felt crisp, typical for early fall. I'd been coming back every week since I'd hired Clifford to look after the place. It wasn't that I didn't trust him. I just needed to see for myself that everything was still secure. The key turned smoothly in the lock. I stepped inside, listening to the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet. The house smelled like lemon furniture polish. Clifford was doing a good job keeping things clean, at least. "Hello?" I called out, though I knew no one would answer. Clifford only came on Tuesdays and Fridays, and today was Saturday. My voice echoed slightly in the empty space. I walked through the first floor, checking windows and doors out of habit. Everything looked normal. The kitchen was spotless, dishes put away. In the living room, the furniture sat covered with sheets to keep the dust off. My grandfather's reading chair was the only piece left uncovered. I ran my hand across its worn arm, feeling the smooth spot where he'd rested his elbow for years. After finishing my inspection downstairs, I stood at the bottom of the staircase, looking up. This was always the hardest part of my visits. I took a deep breath and started climbing, each step feeling heavier than the last. The upstairs hallway stretched before me, ordinary in every way except for what waited at the end. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the runner carpet. When I reached the door, I stopped and stared at it. The steel door looked exactly as it had last week and the week before that. The 3 deadbolts were still firmly locked. The boards I'd nailed across the frame hadn't moved. I pulled out my flashlight and examined every inch of the door frame, looking for cracks or signs of strain. Nothing. I pressed my ear against the cold metal and held my breath, listening. Silence. This was how most of my visits went. I'd listen and hear nothing but the normal sounds of an old house settling. I'd check the locks, the frame, the boards, and find everything secure. Then I'd go home and try not to think about it for another week. I made a note in my book. October 3rd, door secure, no sounds. I'd been keeping this log since the beginning, documenting every visit. It helped make the whole thing feel more normal, more like a routine maintenance task, instead of what it really was. I was about to turn away when I heard it, a faint scratching sound from the other side of the door. My body went cold. I pressed my ear harder against the metal, holding my breath again. There it was. Scratch, 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 like fingernails, too many fingernails, dragging slowly across the inside of the door, searching, testing. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't the first time I'd heard it, but it never got easier. The scratching continued for about 10 seconds, then stopped. I waited, counting to 60 in my head. Nothing more came. I made another note. Scratching sounds at 10:17 a.m. Duration, approx. 10 seconds. My hand was shaking as I wrote. I put the notebook in my pocket and took another step back from the door. Sometimes I wondered what I'd do if the scratching didn't stop. If instead it grew louder, more frantic, accompanied by pounding or, God forbid, a voice. I'd asked myself 100 times what was behind that door. Was it still the shadow thing I'd seen? Had it changed, evolved in some way? Or was it something else entirely now, something that had come through when the window was open? I didn't know, and I never wanted to find out. I remembered my grandfather's journal, his careful notes about the window and the watching presence on the other side. He'd made the right choice, sealing it up. I wished I'd found that journal before opening the window, before letting whatever it was into our world. I checked the door one last time, tugging on each deadbolt to make sure it was secure. Then I walked back down the hallway, trying not to rush, trying to act like everything was normal. Downstairs, I went through the rest of my checklist. I checked the basement to make sure the foundation was solid. I looked at the electrical panel and water main. I examined the windows and exterior doors again. Everything was in order. Before leaving, I sat in my grandfather's chair for a few minutes, something I did at the end of every visit. It helped me feel connected to him, like I was carrying on his work. "I get it now, Grandpa," I said to the empty room. "I understand why you kept it locked." When my grandfather died, I thought I was just inheriting a house, a building, some furniture, maybe some memories. I had no idea what I was really getting. This wasn't just property. It was a responsibility, a duty that had passed from him to me and would someday pass from me to someone else, a vigil that had to be maintained. I'd been angry at first, after I realized what had happened. Why hadn't he told me? Why leave cryptic warnings instead of explaining the danger? But over time, I'd come to understand. Some things you can't explain. You have to experience them to believe them. And he'd never wanted me to experience what was behind that door. I got up and walked to the front door, taking one last look around before leaving. The house seemed to watch me go, as if it knew I'd be back, as if it was counting on it. Driving home, I thought about my life since that night. I'd moved into my grandparents' house permanently, though I kept my distance from that upstairs room. I'd settled into a routine, work, home, occasional dinners with my grandmother or friends. Normal life, except for these weekly visits to check on a door that must never be opened. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if I just walked away, sold the house, moved across the country, and never looked back. But I knew I couldn't do that. Whatever was behind that door was my responsibility now. If I abandoned it, who knew what might happen? What might get out? So I kept coming back, week after week, listening at the door, checking the locks, making my notes, carrying on my grandfather's watch. The next Saturday I was back again. Same routine. Check the first floor, climb the stairs, stand before the door. This time, when I pressed my ear to the metal, I heard nothing. Just silence. I made my note and went home. The Saturday after that, more scratching. Longer this time, almost 30 seconds. It sounded like whatever was in there was moving around the edges of the door, testing for weaknesses. I wrote it down, checked the locks again, and left. On the fourth Saturday, I heard something new. Not just scratching, but a soft thumping, like something pressing against the door. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to send me hurrying down the stairs and out to my car, where I sat with the engine running until my hands stopped shaking. But I came back the next week, and the week after that, and every week since. Sometimes there were sounds, sometimes not. I documented everything in my notebook, which was filling up with dates and times and descriptions. 6 months into my vigil, I realized I needed a better system. I bought a digital recorder and started leaving it in the hallway when I wasn't there. Every Saturday, I'd collect the week's recording and listen to it at home. Most of it was just the ambient sounds of the house, creaking floors, the hum of the furnace, the occasional car passing outside. But sometimes, usually in the dead of night, the recorder picked up the scratching. And once, just once, something that sounded like whispers. I couldn't make out any words, if they were words at all. Just a soft, sibilant sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I never told anyone about what happened, not even my grandmother. What would I say? That I'd opened a window to the past and let something through? That there was a thing living in a sealed room in her old house? She'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. Today's visit was like all the others. I checked the house, climbed the stairs, and stood before the door. When I pressed my ear to it, I heard the scratching again. Just a few seconds, then silence. I made my note and turned to leave, but something made me stop. I looked back at the door, at the solid steel and the heavy deadbolts and the boards nailed across the frame. All that security to contain something that might just be a shadow. But I knew better. The scratching was real. The destruction of that room had been real. Whatever was in there wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I turned away and walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused and looked back up toward the second floor. From here, everything looked normal. You'd never know what lurked at the end of that hall. In the kitchen, I flipped through my notebook, reviewing the past entries. The pattern was inconsistent. Sometimes weeks would pass with no activity. Then I'd record scratching 3 visits in a row. I couldn't figure out what triggered it or if there was any meaning to the timing. I closed the notebook and put it back in my pocket. As I did, my phone buzzed with a text from my grandmother asking if I wanted to come for dinner tomorrow. I texted back that I'd be there, then headed for the front door. Outside, the afternoon sun felt good on my face. I stood on the porch for a minute, just breathing in the fresh air. Looking at the house from the outside with its weathered siding and slightly sagging gutters, it was hard to believe what it contained. Just another old family home on a quiet street. The next week, I was back again. This time, when I pressed my ear to the door, the scratching started immediately. It was more frantic than before, more purposeful. It moved methodically around the perimeter of the door, as if something with too many fingers was searching for a way out. I listened, frozen in place, as the scratching continued for almost a full minute. Then it stopped suddenly, and I heard a soft thud against the door, like something pressing against it. I jumped back, my heart racing. For a wild moment, I thought about opening it. Just a crack, just to see what was in there. The thought came and went so quickly it scared me. That was how it got you, by making you curious enough to do something stupid. I left quickly that day, not bothering with the rest of my usual checks. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the house growing smaller behind me. From the outside, no one would ever guess what that ordinary-looking building held within its walls. Over the months, my visits became part of the rhythm of my life. I'd go to work during the week, have dinner with friends or my grandmother on Sundays, and check the house every Saturday morning. The routine helped make the extraordinary feel ordinary. Sometimes I'd bring Clifford with me, though I never let him near the upstairs room. He'd check the exterior of the house while I dealt with what he called the special room. He never asked questions, which was why I kept him on. "Everything looks good outside," he reported during one visit. "Fixed that loose gutter on the west side. Need to repaint the trim next summer, though." I nodded, only half listening. I'd heard the scratching again that day, longer and louder than before. "Mr. Davenport?" Clifford's voice pulled me back to the present. "You okay? You look a bit pale." "I'm fine," I said. "Just thinking about all the work this old place needs." He nodded, not believing me but knowing better than to press. "Well, I'll keep on top of it. Don't you worry." As the years passed, I thought a lot about my grandfather. He'd kept his vigil for decades, never faltering, never explaining. He must have been so afraid I'd find that key, open that door, and unleash whatever was behind it. And in the end, that's exactly what I'd done. But I'd made it right. I'd sealed it back up, stronger than before. And now, like him, I would spend my remaining years making sure it stayed contained. Sometimes when I sat in his chair in the living room, I'd talk to him as if he could hear me. "I understand now," I'd say. "Why you couldn't tell me. Who would believe it? I wouldn't have, not without seeing it for myself." The house never answered, but sometimes I felt like he was there, nodding in agreement. 5 years into my vigil, my grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep. At her funeral, standing beside her grave, I realized I was truly the last one now. The last Davenport who knew the truth about the house, about the room, about what lurked behind that door. My father had never been interested in the old place. He'd moved away years ago and rarely visited. He didn't understand why I'd moved into my grandparents' house instead of selling it and buying something newer. "It's a money pit," he'd said during his last visit, "and it's too big for just you. Why hang on to it?" I'd given him some vague answer about sentimental value and family history. How could I explain the real reason? That I was the guardian now, that the house and what it contained was my responsibility. After 10 years, I started thinking about the future. I was still young, but not immortal. What would happen to the house, and what it contained when I was gone? I had no children, no one to pass the responsibility to. I updated my will, leaving the house and a substantial sum for its upkeep to a trust. The instructions were clear. The property was to be maintained, the upstairs room was never to be opened, and a caretaker was always to be employed. I named Clifford's son, who had started helping his father with the maintenance, as the first trustee. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best I could do. I hoped it would be enough. Today, standing in the upstairs hallway, listening to the scratching behind the door, I felt the weight of my inheritance. Not just the house, not just the property, but this vigil, this duty to keep whatever was in there from getting out into the world. I'd looked into the past and unleashed something that didn't belong in the present. Something that was still there, still scratching, still trying to find a way out. And now, like Barry Davenport before me, I would spend my life ensuring it stayed contained. I made my final note of the day, locked up the house, and walked to my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house standing quiet in the afternoon sun, holding its secret. I knew I'd be back next week, and the week after that, and every week for as long as I lived, checking the seals, listening at the door, maintaining my grandfather's vigilant watch over whatever lurked behind that forbidden threshold.